Before dawn, 3 wooden ships drifted across a dark and unfamiliar sea. Their sails hung beneath a sky filled with stars. Their crews had not seen land for more than a month. Some believed they were sailing toward the richest kingdoms of Asia. Others feared they were moving farther from home than any man should ever go. And somewhere beyond the black horizon, an entire world waited. Not an empty world, not an undiscovered world. Millions of people already lived there. They had cities, villages, trade routes, languages, kingdoms, rivalries, religions, and histories stretching back thousands of years. But the men aboard those ships knew almost nothing about them. And the people waiting on the distant islands knew nothing about the ships approaching through the darkness. When the sun rose on October 12, 1492, those 2 worlds would meet. The encounter would begin with gifts, smiles, and cautious curiosity. But behind the peaceful first moments stood hunger for gold, competition between empires, religious ambition, disease, slavery, and war. Christopher Columbus believed he had found the edge of Asia. He never understood the true size of his mistake. Yet that mistake would transform nearly every continent on Earth. To understand how 3 small ships crossed the Atlantic and changed history, we must begin long before Columbus saw land. We must return to a Europe that was slowly awakening to the possibilities of the ocean. For centuries, most Europeans had looked toward the east. The richest goods came from distant lands beyond the Mediterranean. Silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, precious stones from India, perfumes, medicines, dyes, carpets, and rare metals moved through enormous networks of merchants and middlemen. A sack of pepper could travel farther than most people would travel in a lifetime. It might pass through ports in Asia, cross deserts in caravans, move through the markets of the Islamic world, and finally arrive in Venice or Genoa. By the time it reached a European table, its price had increased many times. Spices were not merely used to improve food. They were symbols of wealth. They appeared in medicines. They were offered as gifts. They were used in religious ceremonies. To control the spice trade was to control one of the most profitable systems in the known world. But Europeans did not control it. Italian merchants dominated many Mediterranean routes. Muslim merchants and powerful states controlled much of the trade farther east. When the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople in 1453, the event sent a shock through Christian Europe. The city had long stood between Europe and Asia. Its fall did not completely close eastern trade, as later stories sometimes suggest. Merchants continued to move goods across borders. But the rise of Ottoman power made one fact impossible to ignore. European kingdoms wanted new routes. They wanted to reach the sources of wealth without depending on rivals. And the ocean seemed to offer another path. Along the western edge of Europe stood Portugal. It was a relatively small kingdom, but it faced the Atlantic. Portuguese sailors knew the wind, the currents, and the dangers of the open sea. Under the patronage of Prince Henry, later remembered as Henry the Navigator, Portuguese expeditions moved gradually down the coast of Africa. Henry himself was not usually sailing on these voyages. He was an organizer, a sponsor, and a symbol of Portuguese expansion. Sailors pushed beyond points that earlier Europeans had feared. They mapped coastlines. They studied Atlantic winds. They reached Madeira. They settled the Azores. They explored the Canary Islands, although Castile would eventually control them. They learned something that would become essential to Atlantic navigation. The fastest way home was not always the shortest line on a map. To return north from the African coast, Portuguese ships often sailed far west into the Atlantic. There they could catch winds that carried them back toward Europe. This wide curve through the ocean became known as the Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea. It was a quiet revolution in navigation. A ship no longer had to remain close to land. With the correct winds, an experienced captain could enter the open Atlantic and trust the sky and water to lead him home. Portuguese sailors improved the use of instruments such as the mariner's astrolabe. They relied on the compass. They developed better charts. They used ships designed for different purposes. The light and maneuverable caravel became famous for exploration. Larger ships carried more supplies and cargo. Every voyage added new information. Every island became a possible base. Every current became part of a growing map inside the minds of sailors. But this age of exploration was not simply a peaceful search for knowledge. Portuguese expansion brought violence. Trading forts appeared along the African coast. Gold entered Portuguese markets. So did enslaved Africans. By the middle of the 15th century, Portuguese ships were already participating in a growing Atlantic slave trade. The machinery of oceanic empire was beginning to take shape. Sailors, merchants, missionaries, nobles, and monarchs all looked toward the sea for different reasons. Some wanted wealth. Some wanted land. Some wanted converts. Some wanted honor. And some wanted all of these things at once. It was into this world that Christopher Columbus was born. He was probably born in 1451 in the Republic of Genoa, in what is now Italy. Genoa was a city of merchants and sailors. Its ships crossed the Mediterranean. Its traders understood distant markets. Its people lived beside the sea and depended upon it. Columbus's father, Domenico Colombo, worked as a wool weaver and merchant. The family was not among the great nobles of Europe. Young Christopher was not raised in a royal court. He did not inherit an army. He did not command a kingdom. But Genoa offered him something else. It offered a view of the wider world. Columbus went to sea while still young. The details of his earliest voyages are not always clear. Much of what we know about him comes from documents written later, including accounts shaped by Columbus himself and by his son Ferdinand. Columbus wanted others to see him as a man chosen for a great purpose. He sometimes described his life in ways that served that image. But there is little doubt that he gained extensive experience as a sailor and merchant. He traveled through the Mediterranean. He may have sailed as far north as the British Isles, perhaps even Iceland, though some details remain uncertain. He sailed along the coast of West Africa. He lived in Portugal, the center of Atlantic exploration. And everywhere he went, he listened. Sailors carried more than cargo. They carried stories. They spoke of strange wood found drifting from the west. They spoke of carved objects washed onto Atlantic shores. They spoke of islands hidden beyond the horizon. Many such stories were exaggerated. Some were misunderstood. But to a man already fascinated by geography, they suggested possibility. Around 1476, Columbus was involved in a sea battle near Portugal. The exact circumstances are debated. According to traditional accounts, his ship was attacked and burned. Columbus survived by swimming to shore. Whether every detail happened exactly as later told, the result was clear. He settled in Portugal. There he entered a world filled with charts, captains, merchants, and rumors from Africa. He married Filipa Moniz Perestrello. She came from a family connected to Portuguese exploration and Atlantic settlement. Her father had been associated with the island of Porto Santo, near Madeira. Columbus lived for a time on Porto Santo, surrounded by ocean. His wife gave birth to their son Diego. Through her family and through Portuguese sailors, Columbus may have gained access to charts and reports from earlier voyages. The Atlantic was no longer an empty mystery. It was becoming a field of calculation. And Columbus began making a calculation of his own. Most educated Europeans in the 15th century did not believe the earth was flat. The idea that Columbus had to prove the world was round is a later myth. Ancient Greek scholars had argued for a spherical earth many centuries before. Medieval universities taught the same. Sailors could see the evidence with their own eyes. As a ship disappeared over the horizon, its hull vanished before its mast. During a lunar eclipse, the Earth cast a curved shadow across the moon. The real argument was not about the shape of the Earth. It was about its size. Columbus believed the planet was much smaller than it truly is. He also believed Asia extended much farther east. By combining incorrect estimates, misunderstood ancient sources, and optimistic assumptions, he created a world in which Japan and China seemed reachable by sailing west from Europe. In reality, the ocean between Europe and Asia was vast. Between them lay continents unknown to most Europeans. Without the Americas, Columbus's plan would almost certainly have ended in disaster. His ships could not have carried enough food and water to cross the full distance to East Asia. But Columbus did not know that. To him, the westward route seemed difficult but possible. There were reasons for his confidence. He studied the writings of Marco Polo. He read geographical works. He corresponded with Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, a Florentine scholar who also believed Asia could be reached by sailing west. Toscanelli produced ideas and maps that underestimated the distance. Columbus treated these ideas not as speculation, but as confirmation. He filled the margins of books with notes. He connected geography with biblical interpretation. He gradually became convinced that his voyage was not merely practical. It was part of a larger destiny. This belief gave him strength. It also made him stubborn. Columbus was not the only person who imagined sailing west. Others had considered it, but he became the man who refused to abandon the idea. First, he needed royal support. A transatlantic voyage required ships, crews, food, weapons, money, and legal authority. No ordinary merchant could easily provide everything. A king could, anyone who might support him. He found help at the monastery of La Rabida near the port of Palos. The friars there listened to his ideas. Some believed he deserved another chance. One of them, Juan Perez, had connections to Queen Isabella. Columbus also found patrons among Spanish nobles and financiers. Meanwhile, he formed a relationship with Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. They had a son, Ferdinand. Columbus did not marry her, but Ferdinand would later become one of the most important sources about his father's life. Years passed. Columbus watched other explorers achieve what he wanted. In 1488, the Portuguese navigator Bartolomé Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. The route to the Indian Ocean was opening. Portugal appeared closer than ever to reaching Asia by sailing east. This should have weakened Columbus's case. Instead, it increased the pressure on Spain. If Portugal reached the spice markets first, Spain could be left behind. Then, in January 1492, Granada fell. Ferdinand and Isabella entered the city in triumph. The long war was over. For the Spanish monarchy, it was a moment of victory, unity, religious confidence, and new ambition. It was also a dark turning point for religious minorities. Later that same year, the monarchs ordered practicing Jews to convert or leave their kingdoms. Muslims would eventually face forced conversion as well. The same monarchy that prepared to cross the Atlantic was also attempting to create religious uniformity at home. Columbus returned to the court. The negotiations nearly failed again. His demands were still high. According to a famous story, he began riding away when Queen Isabella changed her mind and called him back. The exact drama may have been shaped by later retellings, but the final agreement is real. In April 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. Columbus received promises of titles, authority, and a share of future profits. If he succeeded, he would become admiral of the ocean sea. He would be viceroy and governor of the lands he encountered. He would receive a portion of the wealth. The agreement cost the monarchs relatively little unless the voyage succeeded. For Columbus, it was the foundation of a future dynasty. The expedition would depart from Palos. But finding crews was not easy. Sailing into the unknown frightened, experienced mariners. The town had been ordered to provide ships as part of a legal penalty, but royal commands alone could not create confidence. Columbus needed respected local sailors. He found them in the Pinzon family. Martín Alonso Pinzon was a wealthy and experienced mariner. His brothers, Vicente Yanez Pinzon and Francisco Martín Pinzon, were also skilled sailors. Their involvement helped recruit men. The expedition eventually assembled 3 vessels. The largest was the Santa María. It was a broader cargo ship, and Columbus made it his flagship. The other 2 were smaller caravels. They were the Pinta and the Niña. Niña was probably a nickname connected to her owner, Juan Niño. Her official name may have been Santa Clara. The ships were not enormous. The Santa María was perhaps around 100 feet long, though exact dimensions are uncertain. The caravels were smaller. Together they carried roughly 90 men, perhaps slightly more or less. They carried food, water, wine, weapons, tools, trade goods, and spare equipment. They carried beads, bells, red caps, and other inexpensive objects intended for exchange. They carried no knowledge of the people they would meet. Most of the crew were Spanish. There were sailors, ship owners, officials, servants, and specialists. Luis de Torres, a converted Jew who knew languages including Hebrew and Arabic, joined because Columbus thought he might communicate with people in Asia. An interpreter for China had been selected before anyone knew where the ships would actually arrive. The men knew the voyage would be dangerous, but danger was familiar to sailors. Storms, disease, hunger, shipwreck, and piracy were ordinary risks. What made this journey different was the direction. They would sail west, not toward a known coastline, not along a route marked by familiar ports. They would sail into an ocean that seemed to continue forever. On August 3rd, 1492, the ships left Palos before sunrise. Families watched from shore. Church bells sounded. The vessels moved down the Tinto River and entered the Atlantic. Columbus was 41 years old. He had spent years asking kings to believe him. Now the land behind him was disappearing. The expedition first sailed southwest toward the Canary Islands. Almost immediately, the Pinta developed problems with her rudder. Columbus suspected sabotage, perhaps by owners who had not wanted the ship taken on the expedition. Whether this was true is uncertain. The fleet stopped in the Canaries for repairs. The ships also adjusted their sails. Then, on September 6th, they left the islands. Ahead of them lay the open Atlantic. For the first days, the voyage went smoothly. The trade winds pushed the ships westward. The weather was mild. The sea often seemed calm. The crews saw birds. They saw floating plants. They watched the sun fall into the water each evening. But every day carried them farther from Europe. Sailors measured distance using dead reckoning. They estimated speed and direction, then calculated how far the ships had traveled. Columbus kept two sets of figures. At least, this is what his surviving voyage summary suggests. One number reflected what he believed was the true distance. The other, smaller number was presented to the crew. He may have hoped to prevent fear by making the voyage appear shorter. But the sailors were not fools. They could feel the weeks passing. They knew the wind had been blowing steadily west, and some began to wonder how they would return against it. The ocean itself seemed strange. The compass did not behave exactly as expected. The position of magnetic north appeared to shift in relation to the North Star. Today this is understood as magnetic variation. To sailors in 1492, it was alarming. The instruments they trusted seemed uncertain. Columbus offered explanations. Perhaps the star moved, he suggested, rather than the compass. He needed confidence more than scientific precision. Then the ships entered the Sargasso Sea. Floating masses of seaweed surrounded them. Some sailors feared the plants marked shallow water. Others worried they could trap the ships. The seaweed was not dangerous, but it created the illusion that land must be close. Again and again, signs appeared. Birds flew overhead. A carved stick was said to have been seen. Branches floated past. Clouds formed shapes that looked like distant islands. Someone would cry out. Men would climb into the rigging. The crews would stare toward the horizon. And each time, the supposed land disappeared. The emotional rhythm became exhausting. Hope rose. Hope failed. Another day passed. The trade winds continued pushing them west. By early October, tension grew. Later tradition described the crews as nearly mutinous. The surviving record does show anxiety and complaints, though the image of a dramatic rebellion may have been exaggerated. The sailors wanted results. Columbus promised that land was close. He pointed to birds flying southwest. On October 7th, the fleet changed direction slightly to follow them. This decision may have changed the location of landfall. Without it, the ships might have reached the coast of North America or passed through the Bahamas differently. History can turn on decisions that seem small. A flock of birds. A change in course. A few degrees across an empty sea. On October 10th, the crews complained more openly. They had sailed far beyond the distance Columbus had predicted. He urged them to continue. Some accounts claim he promised to turn back after a few more days if no land appeared. Whether the arrangement was formal or not, the pressure was real. Then, on October 11th, the signs became stronger. The sailors found a small branch with flowers. They saw a carved piece of wood. They noticed plants that seemed freshly washed from land. The air may have carried a different smell. Night fell. The ships continued forward. Columbus later claimed that he saw a faint light moving in the distance, like a candle rising and falling. Not everyone confirmed it. The light may have been on land. It may have been a trick of the waves. It may have existed only in the uncertainty of a man desperate to be right. The monarchs had promised a reward to the first person who saw land. Shortly after midnight, a sailor aboard the Pinta watched the darkness ahead. His name was Rodrigo de Triana. At around 2 in the morning on October 12th, he saw something. A pale line. A shadow. The shape of land beneath the stars. He cried out. A cannon was fired as a signal. The ship slowed. No one wanted to strike a reef in darkness. The crews waited for dawn. Imagine those hours. After more than 5 weeks beyond the Canary Islands, the men could finally see the outline of a shore. They believed they had crossed the Western Ocean to the outer islands of Asia. Some may have thought of gold. Some may have thought of home. Some may simply have felt relief beneath their exhaustion. As daylight spread, the island became clear. Green trees covered the land. The water near shore shone blue and transparent. People appeared along the beach. They were watching the ships. The islanders had never seen vessels like these. The high wooden sides, the great white sails, the metal weapons, the pale, bearded strangers. The Europeans had never seen people like the islanders. They noticed their clothing, ornaments, canoes, and painted bodies. Each group tried to understand the other through the limited language of gesture and expression. Columbus went ashore in a small boat. He carried the royal banner. The captains followed with flags marked by green crosses and the initials of Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus knelt. He gave thanks to God. Then he claimed the island for the Spanish monarchs. The people who lived there were not asked whether their home could be claimed. They called the island Guanahani. Columbus renamed it San Salvador. Its exact modern identity remains debated. Several islands in the Bahamas have been proposed. San Salvador Island is the traditional choice. Other scholars have argued for Samama Cay, Plana Cays, or different locations. The uncertainty remains. But the human encounter is not uncertain. The people Columbus met were part of the Taíno cultural world. The Taíno and related communities inhabited many islands of the Caribbean. They lived in villages led by chiefs, known as caciques. They cultivated cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, and other crops. They fished. They traveled in canoes. They built houses from wood, palm, and thatch. They created hammocks. They played ceremonial ball games. They maintained trade and political networks across the islands. Their societies were not identical. The Caribbean contained many communities, identities, and rivalries. Columbus did not understand this complexity. He called the people Indios because he believed he had reached islands near India. The name came from a geographical error. It would be applied to countless peoples who had never called themselves by such a word. The first encounters appeared peaceful. The islanders brought cotton thread, parrots, food, and other objects. The Europeans offered red caps, glass beads, bells, and small metal items. Columbus noticed that the people were curious about iron. When they touched the edges of swords, some cut themselves because they did not understand the weapon. He described them as physically strong and generous. But even in these first observations, another thought appeared. Columbus believed they could be easily controlled. He wrote that they might become servants. He considered how quickly they could be converted to Christianity. The desire to trade and the desire to dominate were present from the beginning. Columbus searched constantly for signs of gold. He saw small gold ornaments worn by some islanders. Through gestures, he asked where the metal came from. The people pointed toward other islands. Perhaps they wanted the strangers to leave. Perhaps they understood the question differently. Perhaps they were describing trade routes. Columbus interpreted every gesture as a clue leading toward the riches of Asia. He took several islanders aboard his ships. He intended to use them as guides and interpreters. Whether they came willingly at first is unclear. They were not free to leave. The expedition sailed through the Bahamas. Columbus renamed island after island. He was impressed by the beauty of the landscape. The forests seemed endlessly green. The water was clear. Birds filled the air. He repeatedly wrote that the islands were the most beautiful places human eyes had ever seen. But beauty did not satisfy him. He needed gold. He expected wealthy cities. He expected the courts described by Marco Polo. He expected merchants, palaces, spices, and great rulers. Instead, he found island communities whose wealth and political systems were different from what he imagined. Columbus refused to believe his geography might be wrong. He believed Japan, which Europeans called Cipangu, must be nearby. He heard descriptions of a large island called Cuba. To him, Cuba might be Japan, or it might be part of the Asian mainland. On October 28th, the ships reached Cuba. Columbus was amazed by its size and beauty. He sent Luis de Torres and another man inland to find the court of a powerful ruler. The two Europeans carried royal letters intended for the Great Khan of China. Instead of a magnificent Asian palace, they found Taíno villages. They saw people using rolled tobacco leaves. Europeans had encountered tobacco before in the islands, but this inland journey produced one of the earliest recorded European descriptions of smoking. Columbus continued along the Cuban coast. He tried to make the geography fit his expectations. At times he believed Cuba was an island. At other times he insisted it was the Asian mainland. He searched for cities that did not exist. Every river might lead to gold. Every mountain might conceal a mine. Every story from his interpreters became evidence for whatever he already believed. This pattern would follow him for the rest of his life. Columbus could observe the ocean with remarkable skill. But when facts challenged his great idea, he often reshaped the facts. In November, Martín Alonso Pinzón and the Pinta separated from the other ships. The reasons are uncertain. Pinzón may have pursued rumors of gold on his own. Relations between him and Columbus had grown tense. Each man believed he deserved greater credit. The Niña and Santa María continued eastward. In early December, they reached a large island the Taíno called Ayutthaya or Quisqueya. Columbus named it La Española. In English, it became Hispaniola. Today the island contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Hispaniola appeared promising. Its mountains reminded Columbus of Spain. Its rivers contained small traces of gold. Its population was large. Its communities were organized under several powerful caciques. One of these leaders was Guacanagari. He received Columbus with hospitality. Gifts were exchanged. The Europeans were given food. Columbus believed he had found an ally, but neither side fully understood the other. Guacanagari may have seen the strangers as useful partners against rival chiefs. Columbus saw Guacanagari as a local ruler who had accepted Spanish friendship and authority. The difference would soon become dangerous. On the night of December 24th, the Santa María sailed along the coast of Hispaniola. The sea was calm. Columbus had gone to rest. A young and inexperienced crew member was left at the helm, despite orders that an experienced sailor remain in control. The ship drifted onto a reef. By the time the danger was understood, it was too late. The flagship was stuck. The crew cut down the mast. They unloaded supplies. Boats tried to pull the ship free, but the Santa María could not be saved. The sea slowly broke her apart. Guacanagari sent people to help rescue the cargo. Columbus praised their honesty. He wrote that nothing was stolen. The disaster created a new problem. The Niña could not carry every man back to Spain. The Pinta was still missing. Columbus decided to leave a group behind. Timber from the wrecked Santa María was used to build a small fort. Because the wreck occurred near Christmas, Columbus named the settlement La Navidad. 39 men remained there. They had weapons. They had trade goods. They had instructions to search for gold and maintain friendly relations with Guacanagari. Columbus promised to return. La Navidad became the first Spanish settlement created by Columbus in the Americas. It would not survive until his return. In January 1493, the Pinta reappeared. Pinzón claimed he had been separated by weather. Columbus suspected he had deliberately searched for gold alone. The two men argued, but could not afford an open break. They needed each other for the voyage home. On January 16th, the Niña and Pinta left Hispaniola. The return crossing was difficult. The ships sailed northeast to catch the winds that would carry them back toward Europe. For weeks, they saw nothing but ocean. Then a violent Atlantic storm struck. Waves rose around the small vessels. The ships lost sight of each other. Columbus feared he would die before anyone learned what he had achieved. He wrote a brief report of the voyage, sealed it inside a container, and threw it into the sea. He placed another copy in a barrel on the deck. He hoped that if the ship sank, one account might somehow reach land. The Niña survived. Columbus reached the Azores, where he faced trouble with Portuguese authorities. Then another storm drove him toward Portugal itself. On March 4, 1493, the Niña entered the Tagus River near Lisbon. Columbus found himself in the capital of the kingdom that had rejected his plan. King John II received him. The conversation must have been uncomfortable. Columbus claimed lands for Spain that Portugal might have wanted. Portuguese courtiers examined the islanders and objects he had brought. Some reportedly suggested that Columbus should never be allowed to leave. But the king permitted him to continue. On March 15, 1493, the Niña entered Palos. The Pinta arrived the same day. Martín Alonso Pinzón was seriously ill. He died soon afterward. Columbus returned to a world already beginning to change because of him. News spread rapidly. A letter describing the voyage was printed and translated. In an age before electronic communication, the printing press carried Columbus's claims across Europe with remarkable speed. He described beautiful islands, welcoming people, fertile lands, and opportunities for conversion. He spoke of gold. He exaggerated what had been found and suggested much more was waiting. He presented the expedition as an extraordinary success. At the Spanish court, Columbus received a triumphant welcome. He displayed parrots, gold ornaments, plants, and several Taíno captives who had survived the voyage. The monarchs confirmed his titles. He appeared before them dressed as an admiral. For a brief moment, the son of a Genoese wool worker stood at the center of European attention. His impossible idea seemed to have been proven. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. What had he actually reached? Columbus insisted the islands lay near Asia. Some scholars accepted this. Others were uncertain. The lands did not match the detailed descriptions of China or Japan. There were no great Asian cities. There were no armies of the Great Khan. The people did not speak known Asian languages. But geography was still imperfect. It was easier to imagine that Marco Polo had been wrong than to imagine two enormous continents unknown to Europeans. Spain and Portugal now faced a dangerous argument. Both kingdoms claimed rights to explore and conquer new lands. Portugal relied on earlier papal documents that supported its expansion along Africa. Spain sought similar religious authority. Pope Alexander VI issued decrees favoring Spain. Negotiations followed. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. They imagined a line running from north to south through the Atlantic. Lands east of the line would belong to Portugal. Lands west would belong to Spain. No representatives of the people living in those lands were present. Two European monarchies attempted to divide much of the unknown world between them. The line would later help Portugal claim Brazil. For now, Spain rushed to secure Columbus's discoveries. A second expedition was prepared. This time, there would be no 3 small ships carrying 90 uncertain sailors. The second voyage was an imperial fleet. 17 ships were assembled. Around 1,200 to 1,500 people joined, though estimates vary. There were sailors, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, farmers, officials, and would-be settlers. There were horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, dogs, seeds, tools, weapons, and supplies. The first voyage had been an expedition. The second was the beginning of colonization. Columbus sailed from Cadiz on September 25, 1493. The fleet crossed the Atlantic more quickly than before. On November 3rd, it reached an island Columbus named Dominica because it was sighted on a Sunday. The fleet moved through the Lesser Antilles. Columbus named islands as he passed: Marie Galante, Guadeloupe, Montserrat, Antigua, St. Martin, St. Croix. The naming of islands was more than description. It was an act of possession. European names were placed over indigenous names. Maps became tools of empire. On some islands, the Spanish encountered communities they identified as Caribs. The Europeans soon developed a simplified story. The Taíno were described as peaceful and gentle. The Caribs were described as violent cannibals. The reality was more complex. There were conflicts between island communities. Captives were taken. Raids occurred. Some ritual practices may have been misunderstood or exaggerated. But the label of cannibal became politically useful. Spanish law would later allow the enslavement of people declared to be cannibals or enemies. Accusations could transform a community into legal prey. The fleet continued toward Hispaniola. Columbus expected to find the men of La Navidad waiting. He imagined gold collected. He imagined a growing outpost. Instead, the fort was gone. The buildings had been burned. The Spanish men were dead. Guacanagari offered an explanation. The Europeans left at La Navidad had ignored Columbus's orders. They had taken gold. They had seized women. They had fought among themselves. Some had moved into the interior. Their actions provoked local resistance. A powerful cacique named Cayanabo had attacked and destroyed the settlement. Guacanagari claimed he had been injured trying to defend the Spaniards. Columbus may have doubted parts of the story, but the behavior described was entirely possible. The men left at La Navidad had believed themselves protected by superior weapons. They had entered a world whose political dangers they did not understand. Their violence brought retaliation. The first Spanish fort had lasted less than a year. Columbus needed a new settlement. He selected a location on the northern coast of Hispaniola. The colonists unloaded animals, tools, and supplies. They built houses, a church, storehouses, and defensive walls. Columbus named the settlement La Isabela after Queen Isabella. It became the first formal European town established by Spain in the Americas. But the location was poor. The water supply was limited. The soil nearby was not ideal. Food spoiled in the tropical climate. European crops did not always grow as expected. Many settlers were unprepared for physical labor. Some had imagined that gold could simply be collected from the ground. They had not crossed the Atlantic to dig ditches, repair roofs, clear fields, or carry stones. Disease spread. Fever weakened the colony. Hunger increased. Arguments became constant. Columbus was an experienced mariner. He was not an experienced governor. At sea, authority could be direct. A captain gave orders. A sailor obeyed. On land, the problems were different. Nobles resisted discipline. Laborers demanded food. Officials wrote complaints. Settlers blamed Columbus for every hardship. Columbus blamed the settlers for laziness and disobedience. At the center of the conflict stood gold. The Spanish crown had invested in the voyage. Columbus had promised wealth. If Hispaniola did not produce gold, his enemies in Spain would say the expedition was a failure. Columbus sent parties into the interior. Small amounts of gold were found in riverbeds and mountain regions, but not the rich cities he had described. The Spanish built forts to control routes and mining areas. Relations with Taíno communities deteriorated. The settlers demanded food. They interfered with local politics. They took women. They used violence. The arrival of hundreds of foreigners placed enormous pressure on island communities. The newcomers did not grow enough food for themselves. They expected the Taíno to supply them. When villages resisted, the Spanish treated resistance as rebellion. Cayanabo emerged as one of the strongest opponents of Spanish expansion. He was associated with the destruction of La Navidad. Spanish accounts portrayed him as dangerous and powerful. Columbus needed to capture him. According to a famous story, the Spanish commander Alonso de Ojeda used deception. Ojeda approached Cayanabo with polished metal handcuffs. He described them as royal ornaments. Cayanabo allowed the restraints to be placed on his wrists. The Spanish then seized him. The story may have been shaped by later legend, but Cayanabo was captured. He was placed on a ship bound for Spain. He never arrived. The ship sank or he died during the voyage. Resistance continued. In 1495, Columbus led armed forces against Taíno warriors. The Spanish had steel swords, crossbows, firearms, cavalry, and war dogs. The Taíno had courage and knowledge of the land, but they did not possess weapons capable of matching European armor and mounted attacks. Spanish accounts described a great battle, though troop numbers were probably exaggerated. The result was a Spanish victory. Then came a system of tribute. In regions where gold was expected, Taíno adults were ordered to provide a regular amount of gold dust. Those who lived in places without gold might provide cotton. Tokens were issued to show that tribute had been paid. The demands were often impossible. Hispaniola did not contain the vast accessible gold deposits Columbus had imagined. People fled into the mountains. Fields were abandoned. Food production declined. Punishments were severe. Some people resisted. Some died from hunger. Some died through violence. Some took their own lives. The peaceful island described in Columbus's first letter was becoming a place of forced labor and fear. The demographic disaster that followed cannot be reduced to a single cause. Violence played a role. Forced labor played a role. Social disruption and hunger played roles. But disease would become the greatest killer. Europeans carried illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. The most catastrophic epidemics came in later years, especially after smallpox reached Hispaniola around 1518. The indigenous people of the Americas had no previous exposure to many Old World diseases. Their immune systems had never encountered them. Communities suffered devastating mortality. Exact population figures remain debated, but the scale of loss is not. Within a few generations, the Taíno population of Hispaniola had collapsed. A world of villages, families, languages, and traditions was shattered. Columbus did not understand germs. No one in 1492 understood disease in the modern sense. He did not deliberately carry epidemics as biological weapons, but Spanish colonization created the conditions in which disease spread rapidly. Ships connected previously separated populations. Settlements concentrated people. Forced movement carried illness from place to place. Hunger weakened communities. The biological consequences of contact moved faster than any army. Meanwhile, Columbus struggled to maintain control over his own colonists. Some wanted to return to Spain. Others accused him of hiding food. Many resented being ruled by a Genoese foreigner and his brothers. Columbus placed great authority in the hands of his brothers Bartolomeo and Diego. To Spanish settlers, this looked like a family government. Complaints traveled across the Atlantic. Columbus sent ships back to Spain carrying reports, gold, and enslaved Taíno captives. Hundreds of islanders were captured during raids. Some were shipped to Europe to be sold. Many died during the crossing. Queen Isabella expressed concern about enslaving people she considered her subjects. Spanish policy remained inconsistent. The monarchy sometimes condemned unauthorized enslavement while permitting slavery under other categories, especially for people labeled rebels or cannibals. Legal arguments could not protect those trapped beneath colonial power. Columbus believed enslaved captives could help make the colony profitable. He also continued to describe conversion to Christianity as a central goal. To his mind, conquest, labor, trade, and religion could exist together. The contradictions did not trouble him as deeply as they trouble later generations. He lived in a world where warfare, forced conversion, and slavery were widely practiced. But historical context does not erase responsibility. Columbus made choices. He created systems. He rewarded men who used violence. He sent captives across the sea, and the suffering caused by those decisions became part of his legacy. In 1496, Columbus returned to Spain to defend himself. He left his brother Bartolomeo in charge. The colony was still unstable. La Isabela was gradually abandoned. A new settlement was established on the southern coast of Hispaniola. It became Santo Domingo. Unlike La Isabela, Santo Domingo survived. It would become the center of Spanish power in the Caribbean. Columbus arrived in Spain wearing the simple clothing of a religious penitent. The image was carefully chosen. He wanted to show humility. He also brought gold, captives, and exotic objects. He still promised greater wealth. Ferdinand and Isabella listened. They did not remove him, but their confidence was weakening. Portugal had now achieved what Columbus had originally hoped to accomplish. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa. The Portuguese eastern route was real. It led to established cities, major ports, spices, and wealthy markets. Columbus's western islands seemed less impressive by comparison. He needed a new voyage. He needed to find the Asian mainland. On May 30th, 1498, Columbus departed Spain on his third expedition. He commanded 6 ships. 3 sailed directly toward Hispaniola with supplies. Columbus took the others farther south. He believed lands near the equator might contain greater wealth. The voyage became dangerously hot. Food spoiled. Water ran low. The crews suffered. Then, on July 31st, they saw an island with 3 peaks. Columbus named it Trinidad, after the Holy Trinity. To the south lay a vast coastline. The ships entered the Gulf of Paria. Powerful currents flowed through the water. The sea became unexpectedly fresh in places. Columbus realized that an enormous river must be emptying nearby. A river of such size could not come from a small island. He had reached the coast of South America, near the mouth of the Orinoco. For the first time, Columbus stood beside a continental landmass of the Americas. Yet he still did not recognize it as a new continent. He developed another explanation. Perhaps this was the edge of the earthly paradise. Medieval Christian tradition sometimes placed the Garden of Eden in a distant region of the east. Columbus believed the earth might not be perfectly round. He imagined it shaped somewhat like a pear, with a raised region near paradise. The fresh water, lush landscape, and powerful rivers seemed to confirm his spiritual geography. Columbus was capable of extraordinary practical navigation. At the same time, his understanding of the world remained deeply medieval. He calculated winds and currents. He also searched for Eden. He measured distance. He also interpreted prophecy. He wanted gold. He also believed he was participating in God's plan for the final age of history. The third voyage moved along the coast of present-day Venezuela before turning toward Hispaniola. When Columbus arrived at Santo Domingo, he found rebellion. The colony had divided into factions. A leader named Francisco Roldan had challenged the authority of Columbus's brothers. Roldan's followers complained of hunger, unpaid wages, harsh punishment, and broken promises. They also wanted access to indigenous labor and women. Columbus lacked enough loyal soldiers to defeat them. He negotiated. The rebels received concessions. Some were allowed to return to Spain. Others received land and control over Taíno labor. To restore peace, Columbus weakened his own authority and expanded the exploitation of the islanders. Reports of chaos reached the Spanish court. Settlers returning to Spain gathered near the royal palace and accused Columbus of cruelty and incompetence. They claimed he had failed to provide food. They described executions and mutilations. Some accusations may have been exaggerated by political enemies, but the colony was clearly in crisis. Ferdinand and Isabella sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo in 1500. He carried broad royal authority. When he reached the harbor, he saw the bodies of executed Spaniards hanging from gallows. Columbus was away from the town. His brother Diego refused to recognize Bobadilla's authority without further proof. Bobadilla seized the royal fort and treasury. He encouraged settlers to present complaints. Then he arrested Columbus and his brothers. The admiral of the ocean sea was placed in chains. Columbus was sent back across the Atlantic as a prisoner. The sight was shocking. Only 7 years earlier, he had returned in triumph. Now he sat beneath the deck of a ship wearing iron restraints. The captain offered to remove them. Columbus refused. He said the monarchs had ordered the chains placed upon him, and only they should remove them. He kept the chains afterward. According to his son, he wanted them buried with him. The gesture was dramatic. Columbus believed he had been betrayed. He saw himself as a loyal servant punished by jealous men. He did not see the colony through the eyes of the Taíno people forced to provide gold. He did not see himself as the cause of the crisis. In his mind, he remained the chosen discoverer, surrounded by enemies. When Columbus reached Spain, public reaction worked in his favor. Ferdinand and Isabella ordered his release. They expressed regret over the humiliation. Bobadilla had exceeded expectations, but the monarchs did not restore Columbus as governor. His political authority in Hispaniola was effectively over. He kept the title of admiral. He kept some financial rights. But another governor, Nicolas de Ovando, was appointed. Ovando would oversee a much larger colonial system. His rule would bring new towns, mining, forced labor, and further violence against indigenous communities. The conquest no longer depended on Columbus. The machinery he helped begin could move without him. Still, Columbus wanted one more chance. He remained convinced that a passage to Asia must exist. If he could find a strait through the lands to the south, he could reach the Indian Ocean. He could prove that his western route was the true path to the riches of Asia. The monarchs agreed to a fourth voyage, but they placed restrictions on him. He was not supposed to interfere with the government of Hispaniola. He was to explore, not rule. In May 1502, Columbus left Spain with 4 ships and around 140 men. He was about 51 years old. Years at sea had damaged his health. He suffered from painful swelling, fevers, and periods of weakness. His young son Ferdinand, around 13 years old, traveled with him. Columbus's brother Bartolomeo also joined. The expedition crossed the Atlantic and reached the Caribbean. A powerful hurricane began forming. Columbus recognized the signs: the air, the clouds, the behavior of the sea. He sailed toward Santo Domingo and requested permission to shelter in the harbor. Governor Ovando refused. At the same time, a large fleet was preparing to leave Hispaniola for Spain. Columbus warned that the ships should remain in port. His warning was ignored. He guided his own vessels to a protected area. The hurricane struck. Many ships in the homeward fleet sank. Hundreds of people died. Among them was Francisco de Bobadilla, the man who had arrested Columbus. A large shipment of gold disappeared beneath the waves. One ship survived and reached Spain. It carried gold belonging to Columbus. To Columbus, this may have seemed like divine judgment. His enemies had drowned. His property survived. But the storm also revealed something real. Whatever his failures as a governor, Columbus remained a gifted sailor. He continued west. The ships reached the coast of Central America near present-day Honduras. They encountered a large trading canoe carrying goods such as cotton cloth, wooden weapons, copper objects, and cacao. The canoe may have belonged to merchants connected with the Maya world. It offered a glimpse of more complex societies to the west. Had Columbus followed the traders north, he might have encountered the cities and political systems of Mesoamerica. Instead, he continued along the coast searching for a passage through the continent. He explored the shores of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Storms battered the expedition. Rain fell for days. Winds turned against the ships. The coast was dangerous. The vessels leaked. Shipworms ate into the wooden hulls. The crews suffered from exhaustion and disease. Columbus named one area Cape Gracias a Dios, thanks to God, after escaping severe weather. The expedition searched every bay and river mouth for a strait. Local people spoke of another sea and of rich lands. They may have been referring to the Pacific Ocean and regions farther south or west. But Columbus could not reach it. At Veragua, in present-day Panama, the Spanish found signs of gold. Columbus attempted to establish a settlement. He named it Santa María de Bullen. The plan failed. Local resistance increased. The region's leader, known in Spanish accounts as Quibian, opposed the foreign settlement. The Spanish tried to capture him. He escaped. Fighting followed. Several Europeans were killed. The river became difficult to leave because shifting sand blocked its mouth. The settlement was abandoned. By 1503, the ships were barely seaworthy. 2 had to be left behind. The remaining vessels struggled north toward Hispaniola. They could not reach it. On June 25, 1503, Columbus grounded the ships on the coast of Jamaica. The hulls were too damaged to continue. The expedition was stranded. The men built shelters on the decks. At first, local Taíno communities provided food in exchange for beads, bells, and other goods. Columbus sent 2 men, Diego Mendez and Bartolomé Fieschi, to seek help. They crossed from Jamaica to Hispaniola in canoes. The journey was dangerous. They faced open water, heat, thirst, and currents. Eventually, they reached the island. But rescue did not come quickly. Governor Ovando had little desire to help Columbus return. Months passed. The stranded crew became restless. 2 brothers, Francisco and Diego de Porres, led a rebellion. They accused Columbus of hiding the truth. They seized canoes and attempted to reach Hispaniola. The effort failed. They returned to Jamaica and moved through local villages, taking food by force. The relationship between the islanders and the stranded Europeans collapsed. Communities stopped supplying Columbus's group. Hunger threatened the camp. Columbus needed a way to restore his authority. He had an astronomical almanac. It predicted a lunar eclipse on February 29, 1504. Columbus called local leaders to meet him. He warned that his god was angry because they no longer provided food. As proof, he said, the moon would lose its light. That night, the eclipse began. The shadow of the earth moved across the moon. Its surface darkened and turned red. The islanders had their own knowledge of the sky, but they may not have expected the timing of the eclipse. According to the account written by Columbus's son Ferdinand, the people were frightened. They asked Columbus to restore the moon. He withdrew into his cabin, supposedly to speak with God. He used an hourglass to time the eclipse. When the shadow began to pass, he announced that forgiveness had been granted. Food supplies resumed. The episode is often told as a clever trick. It was also an act of manipulation. Columbus used knowledge as a weapon against people who were feeding his stranded crew. Meanwhile, the rebellion continued. Armed conflict broke out between loyalists and the Porres brothers. Bartolomeo Columbus defeated the rebels. The survivors were captured. Finally, in June 1504, a rescue ship arrived. Columbus had been stranded in Jamaica for about a year. He reached Hispaniola, then sailed for Spain. He arrived in November 1504. The world he returned to had changed. Queen Isabella was dying. She passed away on November 26th. Her death weakened Columbus's position. Isabella had supported his first voyage and sometimes intervened in colonial matters. King Ferdinand treated Columbus with formal respect but resisted restoring his privileges. Columbus spent his final years pursuing legal claims. He wanted the titles and revenues promised in the capitulations of Santa Fe. He wrote letters. He gathered documents. He followed the royal court despite poor health. He complained that the crown had failed to honor its agreement. To the end, he remained focused on his rights as admiral and viceroy. He also became increasingly absorbed in religious prophecy. He compiled writings sometimes called the Book of Prophecies. He connected his voyages to biblical passages. He believed the wealth of the new lands might help finance a campaign to recover Jerusalem. Columbus did not see himself simply as an explorer. He saw himself as an instrument of divine history. Yet he still did not accept that he had reached continents unknown to Europeans. He continued to describe the lands as part of Asia or as islands near it. Other navigators were beginning to understand the truth. John Cabot, sailing for England, had reached the coast of North America in 1497. Portuguese expeditions explored parts of the western Atlantic. Pedro Álvares Cabral reached Brazil in 1500. Spanish and Portuguese sailors mapped long coastlines that did not fit existing ideas of Asia. Among the explorers was Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant and navigator. Vespucci participated in voyages along the coast of South America. Letters published under his name argued that these lands formed a new part of the world. The authenticity and authorship of some Vespucci letters have been debated, but the idea spread. In 1507, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller published a large world map. He labeled the new southern continent America, using a Latinized form of Amerigo's name. Waldseemüller later reconsidered the choice, but the name remained. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic and created the lasting connection. Another man's name appeared on the map. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid, Spain. He was around 54 years old. He was not a forgotten beggar, as some later legends claimed. He still possessed status and income, but he died frustrated. The royal court had not restored his full power. The great wealth he imagined had not arrived in the form he expected. He had not reached the courts of China. He had not found a western strait to India. He did not know that the lands across the Atlantic would be called America. His remains were moved several times. They were first buried in Valladolid. Later they were transferred to Seville. Then, according to traditional accounts, they were taken across the Atlantic to Santo Domingo. When Spain lost part of Hispaniola, remains believed to be his were moved to Havana. After Spain lost Cuba in 1898, they were taken back to Seville. But in Santo Domingo, another container was discovered bearing Columbus's name. Today, both Seville and Santo Domingo have claimed to possess at least some of his remains. Scientific testing has supported the identification of the bones in Seville as belonging to Columbus or a close relative, though questions remain about whether his remains may have been divided. Even in death, Columbus continued to cross the Atlantic. His voyages are often reduced to a simple sentence. In 1492, Columbus discovered America. But every word in that sentence requires examination. He was not the first human to discover the Americas. The ancestors of indigenous peoples had entered and settled the continents thousands of years earlier. They built some of the greatest civilizations in human history. The cities of Teotihuacan and Tenochtitlan, the Maya kingdoms, the Inca Empire, the mound-building cultures of North America, the great networks of the Mississippi Valley, the pueblos of the Southwest, the communities of the Caribbean, the peoples of the Arctic, the forests, the plains, the mountains, and the coasts. They knew their own lands. They named their rivers. They mapped their worlds through memory, story, trade, and travel. Columbus did not discover them. He entered their history. He was not even the first European known to have reached the Americas. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors crossed the North Atlantic. Leif Erikson is traditionally associated with a voyage to a land called Vinland. Archaeological remains at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirm that Norse people established a settlement in North America centuries before Columbus. Their presence was brief. It did not create a permanent link between Europe and the Americas. Knowledge of the voyages survived in Norse sagas but did not reshape the wider world. Other proposed pre-Columbian contacts remain debated. Columbus's importance lies elsewhere. His voyage created a continuous connection. After 1492, ships kept crossing. Maps changed. Empires expanded. Plants, animals, diseases, people, religions, languages, and technologies moved between hemispheres. The Atlantic became a highway. This transformation is often called the Columbian Exchange. The name can sound calm and balanced. The reality was enormous, unequal, creative, and catastrophic. From the Americas came crops that transformed diets across the world. Maize spread through Europe, Africa, and Asia. Potatoes traveled from the Andes and eventually became essential in many European societies. Tomatoes entered Mediterranean cooking. Cacao became chocolate. Tobacco spread globally. Chili peppers traveled to India, China, Korea, Thailand, and countless other regions, becoming so deeply rooted that many cuisines now seem unimaginable without them. Cassava reached Africa and became a major food source. Peanuts, pineapples, vanilla, and many varieties of beans crossed the ocean. From Europe, Africa, and Asia came wheat, rice, sugarcane, coffee, bananas, and citrus fruits. Horses returned to the Americas, where their distant ancestors had once lived before becoming extinct there. Indigenous peoples of the plains would later develop new horse cultures that transformed travel, hunting, and warfare. Cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens spread through colonial landscapes. Pigs escaped and multiplied. Cattle herds changed grasslands. European farming altered ecosystems. But the exchange also carried disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Other infections followed. Epidemics traveled ahead of European armies. In some regions, communities were devastated before they ever saw a European face. Population estimates before contact are debated, and losses varied by place and time. Yet historians agree that indigenous populations suffered one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in recorded history. Entire families disappeared. Political systems weakened. Fields were left untended. Knowledge keepers died. Songs, stories, and memories vanished with them. The collapse made conquest easier. It did not make conquest inevitable. Indigenous peoples resisted in countless ways. They fought. They negotiated. They formed alliances. They moved. They adapted European tools to their own purposes. They preserved languages and traditions. They survived. The history after Columbus is not simply a story of Europeans acting while indigenous people disappeared. It is a history of continuous indigenous action, survival, resistance, and transformation. The Atlantic connection also accelerated the forced movement of Africans. Europeans had begun trading enslaved Africans across the Atlantic before Columbus's voyages. But the colonial plantation system expanded the trade to a terrifying scale. Sugar production became especially important. Sugar was profitable. It also demanded enormous labor. On islands where indigenous populations had collapsed, colonists increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. Over the following centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forced onto Atlantic slave ships. Millions were taken to Brazil and the Caribbean. Others were taken to Spanish America and North America. Countless people died during capture, forced marches, confinement, and the Middle Passage. The modern Atlantic world was built partly through their stolen labor. Columbus did not create every system that followed. He did not plan the conquest of Mexico. He did not build the later plantation empires. He did not design the entire transatlantic slave trade. But his voyages opened the door through which these forces moved. That is why his legacy carries such weight. To some generations, Columbus became a symbol of courage. He represented the sailor who crossed an unknown ocean. He represented ambition, faith, persistence, and the willingness to challenge accepted limits. Immigrant communities, especially Italian Americans in the United States, later embraced Columbus as a source of pride in a society that often treated them with discrimination. Columbus Day became a national holiday. Statues rose in cities. Schools taught children simple poems about 1492. The story offered a heroic beginning for European America. But a heroic beginning for one group can hide a disaster for another. For indigenous communities, Columbus often represents invasion, colonization, enslavement, and the beginning of demographic collapse. His own writings contain plans to exploit labor. The government he created in Hispaniola used tribute and force. People were captured and shipped across the Atlantic. Settlers under his authority committed violence. These facts are not inventions of modern critics. They appear in records from the period. The debate over Columbus is sometimes presented as a choice between two false extremes. Either he must be a perfect hero who discovered a new world through pure courage, or he must be a uniquely evil man responsible for every horror that followed. History is more difficult. Columbus was courageous. Crossing the Atlantic in 1492 required skill and determination. He was also deeply mistaken about geography. He was an excellent navigator in some ways and a poor governor in others. He could describe natural beauty with wonder. He could also describe human beings as potential servants. He believed sincerely in Christianity. He participated in enslavement. He suffered from political betrayal. He also betrayed the trust of people who first received him peacefully. He was shaped by the violence and ambition of his century, and he helped intensify them. Understanding him does not require admiration. It does not require hatred. It requires us to look directly at the record. The story also forces us to ask why Columbus succeeded when others did not. He was not the best mathematician. His estimate of the Earth's size was wrong. He was not the first to imagine a western route. He was rejected repeatedly, yet several forces came together around him. Atlantic navigation had improved. Portuguese voyages had revealed the wind systems of the ocean. Shipbuilding had advanced. The compass and charts made long-distance sailing more practical. The Spanish monarchy had completed the conquest of Granada and was ready for new expansion. Competition with Portugal created urgency. The printing press spread news of the voyage. European merchants wanted direct access to Asian wealth. Religious ambition encouraged conversion and conquest. Columbus stood at the meeting point of these forces. He did not create the age by himself, but he became its most famous face. Chance also played a role. Had the Americas not stood between Europe and Asia, the first voyage likely would have failed. Had the trade winds changed, the ships might have turned back. Had the fleet sailed a slightly different course, it might have missed the Bahamas. Had the Santa María not struck the reef, La Navidad might never have been built. Had the Portuguese king accepted Columbus, Brazil and the Caribbean might have entered a different imperial system. Had Martín Alonso Pinzón not supported the expedition, Columbus might never have found a crew. History often appears inevitable only after it has happened. Before October 1492, the voyage was a gamble. Afterward, every kingdom wanted to understand what lay across the Atlantic. The news changed imagination before it changed maps. Europeans had long told stories of distant islands. Some maps showed legendary lands such as Antillia, the Isle of Seven Cities. Sailors whispered about islands that appeared through mist and vanished. After Columbus, the ocean no longer seemed like the edge of the known world. It became a space to cross. Spanish expeditions multiplied. Juan Ponce de Leon reached Florida. Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean in 1513. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition later crossed that ocean and completed the first circumnavigation of the Earth, though Magellan himself died in the Philippines. Hernán Cortés and his indigenous allies overthrew the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro and his allies conquered the Inca Empire. Silver from the Americas flowed through Europe and across the Pacific to Asia. Global trade networks tightened. The world economy became more deeply connected. But connection did not mean equality. Spain claimed enormous territories. Portugal established Brazil. England, France, and the Netherlands entered the competition. Colonial borders cut through indigenous lands. Missionaries sought converts. Armies sought tribute. Settlers sought farms. Merchants sought profit. The Atlantic world became a place of movement and mixture. European, African, and indigenous peoples created new cultures, languages, foods, religions, and identities. But these new societies were born within systems of conquest and slavery. The modern world carries both sides of that inheritance. The language spoken in much of the Americas reflects colonization. So do many borders. So do legal systems, religions, and city names. At the same time, indigenous languages survive. African traditions survive. Communities rebuilt themselves under impossible pressure. The history did not end with conquest. It continues. Perhaps the strangest part of Columbus's story is that he never truly saw what he had done. He believed he had reached the outer regions of Asia. Even when he encountered the enormous rivers of South America, he tried to fit them into older maps. Even when coastlines stretched farther than expected, he searched for explanations that protected his original belief. He crossed the boundary of one age while carrying the imagination of another. He was a medieval man opening the door to the early modern world. His ships carried crosses, swords, contracts, bells, beads, charts, and dreams of Asia. They returned carrying people, plants, gold ornaments, and news of lands no European map could properly contain. The ships themselves were fragile. Wooden hulls leaked. Sails tore. Food rotted. Sailors slept in crowded conditions. Rats moved through the darkness. Fresh water became foul. Storms could erase an expedition in a single night. Yet those vessels crossed an ocean and created a connection that would never close again. There is a temptation to imagine the morning of October 12th as a single dramatic instant. Columbus steps onto the sand. A flag rises. One world discovers another. But the reality was slower. The Taíno watched the boats approach. The Europeans struggled through shallow water. Words were spoken that neither side understood. Objects passed from hand to hand. Eyes examined unfamiliar faces. No one present could see the centuries ahead. The islanders could not know that disease and conquest would soon destroy much of their world. The sailors could not know that they had reached continents larger than Europe. Columbus could not know that his name would become a battlefield. In that first moment, there was curiosity. There may also have been fear. Perhaps some people smiled. Perhaps others stood back. Children may have watched from behind their parents. The sea moved quietly against the shore. The ships rested beyond the reef. History had not yet revealed the cost. That cost became clear on Hispaniola. The island became the center of the first Spanish colonial experiment in the Americas. Here the promises of exploration became the realities of occupation. Settlers needed food. Officials demanded gold. The crown expected profit. The Taíno were forced into systems of labor. Spanish factions fought one another. Colonial government developed through improvisation and violence. Later, the encomienda system granted colonists control over indigenous labor and tribute in return for supposed protection and religious instruction. In practice, it often became brutal exploitation. A young Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas witnessed parts of this world. He initially benefited from colonial labor systems. Later, he became one of their most famous critics. Las Casas described terrible violence against indigenous people. Some historians debate specific numbers and rhetorical elements in his accounts. He wrote to persuade the Spanish crown to act, but the broad reality of abuse is supported by many sources. Las Casas argued that indigenous people possessed reason, rights, and souls. He insisted they could not justly be conquered or enslaved. His campaign influenced Spanish debates and laws. Yet he could not stop colonial expansion. For a time, he suggested African labor as an alternative to indigenous enslavement, a position he later regretted. Even those who condemned one injustice could remain trapped inside another. Spain itself debated the morality of conquest. Theologians and legal scholars asked whether the crown had the right to rule distant peoples. Francisco de Vitoria argued that indigenous nations possessed legitimate property and political authority. The Valladolid debate in the 16th century examined arguments about conquest and human nature. These debates were significant. But while Europeans discussed rights in universities and royal chambers, colonization continued on the ground. The distance between law and reality remained vast. Columbus stood near the beginning of that contradiction. He sometimes wrote admiringly of the Taíno. He noted their generosity. He praised their intelligence and appearance. He also claimed their lands. He captured them. He demanded tribute. He believed conversion would justify Spanish authority. He could recognize humanity and still support domination. That contradiction was not unique to him. It became one of the foundations of empire. The story of Columbus is also the story of information. He relied on ancient texts. He interpreted Marco Polo. He listened to sailors. He misunderstood Taíno gestures. He translated local names through European expectations. A sign toward the south became a promise of gold. A story of another ruler became evidence of the Great Khan. A large island became Japan. A continental river became the water of Eden. Columbus did not simply explore geography. He carried a geography inside his mind. And that imagined world shaped what he was able to see. All people do this. We interpret the unknown through what we already believe. But when the observer commands ships and soldiers, mistakes can become systems. A misunderstanding can become a map. A map can become a claim. A claim can become an empire. Even the word discovery carries power. To discover something is to place the discoverer at the center. It suggests that the place becomes real only when the outsider sees it. The Americas were not waiting to be made real. They were full of histories. On Hispaniola, generations of families had farmed the soil. Across the Caribbean, canoe routes connected communities. In Mesoamerica, scholars observed the stars and recorded dynasties. In the Andes, roads crossed mountains. In North America, trade networks moved shells, copper, stone, stories, and ideas across enormous distances. The continents were not silent. Europe simply had not been listening. Yet Columbus's voyage remains a discovery in another sense. Europe discovered that its maps were incomplete. Europe discovered that the Atlantic led not directly to Asia but to lands it had not expected. Europe discovered opportunities for wealth and expansion. And indigenous peoples discovered, with terrible consequences, that powerful strangers had arrived from across the sea. Discovery was mutual. Power was not. The ships returned again and again. That is what separated 1492 from earlier contacts. The Norse settlement in Newfoundland faded. Columbus's route became permanent. He recorded winds, distances, and islands. Others could follow. His letters created excitement. The Spanish crown claimed territory. Colonies produced supplies for further expeditions. The voyage became reproducible. Once a route can be repeated, exploration becomes migration. Migration becomes settlement. Settlement becomes control. Control becomes empire. The Atlantic currents themselves helped shape the process. Ships from Europe sailed south toward the Canary Islands. Trade winds carried them west. To return, they sailed north until they found westerly winds leading back to Europe. This great circular system became the road of empire. For centuries, vessels followed similar patterns. Merchant ships, warships, missionary vessels, treasure fleets, slave ships. The winds that carried Columbus would carry millions of others, most of whom had no choice in the journey. Gold remained central to the Spanish dream. The small ornaments seen in the Bahamas created expectations out of proportion to reality. Hispaniola produced some gold, but not enough to satisfy every settler. Later conquests in Mexico and Peru brought vast treasures. Silver mines at Potosi and elsewhere transformed the global economy. But on the first voyage, gold was mostly a rumor. Columbus followed that rumor from island to island. The pursuit of wealth shaped every decision. Where is gold? Who is gold? Who can be forced to collect it? Which ruler controls the mines? The questions grew more urgent as promises to the crown became harder to fulfill. Columbus had to turn landscapes and people into profit. When gold proved limited, human beings themselves became cargo. This was the darkest transformation of the voyage. At first, the islanders were guides. Then they became captives. Then potential servants. Then tribute payers. Then enslaved people sent to Europe. The change happened quickly because the idea was present from the first encounter. Columbus saw generosity. He also saw vulnerability. The Taíno did not lack courage. They lacked immunity to European disease and experience with European methods of war. They lived in societies shaped by their own conflicts and values. They could not predict that the strangers' hunger would continue after their ships were filled. They did not know Spain could send 17 ships, then more after that. They did not know the encounter was not a visit. It was the beginning of a permanent invasion. For the Spanish sailors, the ocean crossing was the greatest danger. For the people of the Caribbean, the danger arrived when the crossing succeeded. And still, the first voyage contained moments of wonder. Columbus listened to unfamiliar birds. He described forests so green they seemed to touch the sky. Sailors tasted fruits they had never seen. They watched canoes move swiftly across clear water. The Taíno examined metal knives and woven European cloth. They touched the ship's ropes. They looked at the sails. Human curiosity existed beside ambition. That is part of what makes the story so unsettling. History's darkest events do not always begin with hatred. Sometimes they begin with fascination. Then one side realizes it has greater military power. Curiosity becomes possession. Exchange becomes demand. Hospitality becomes occupation. By the time the pattern is understood, it may be too late. Columbus's personality mattered. He could inspire people. Without confidence, he would never have persuaded patrons or crews. He could endure ridicule. He survived rejection after rejection. He was willing to gamble his life on an idea. But the same qualities had another side. Confidence became certainty. Persistence became obsession. Faith in his mission made him less willing to admit mistakes. He believed titles and authority were owed to him. He treated resistance as betrayal. He recorded grievances for years. The man who refused to turn back from the Atlantic also refused to turn back from his own interpretation of the world. Even his relationship with the Pinzon brothers reveals the mixture of cooperation and rivalry behind the voyage. Martín Alonso Pinzon helped make the expedition possible. His local reputation recruited crews. His experience strengthened the fleet. During the crossing, he offered advice. Yet after landfall, the relationship fractured. Pinzon searched independently. Columbus feared losing credit. On the return, both men raced toward recognition. History later placed Columbus above all others. The sailors became names in a list. Rodrigo de Triana saw land. But Columbus claimed the royal reward, arguing that his mysterious light had come first. The people who made the voyage possible slowly disappeared behind the admiral's legend. Even the monarchs became part of the myth. A famous story claims Queen Isabella pawned her jewels to fund Columbus. There is little evidence that this happened. The expedition was financed through a combination of royal support, local obligations, and private contributions. The cost was not insignificant, but it was not an impossible fortune. Later storytellers preferred a dramatic image. A queen sacrifices her jewels. A visionary sailor defies a flat earth world. 3 tiny ships enter endless darkness. Land appears. A new world is born. The true story is less simple and far more powerful. Columbus did not defeat ignorance alone. He used knowledge gathered by generations of Portuguese, Mediterranean, and Atlantic sailors. The Earth's roundness was not the mystery. Its geography was. The ships were small but not helpless. The crews were afraid but experienced. The monarchs were cautious investors, not dreamers blinded by faith. The first encounter was not the creation of an empty continent. It was the collision of worlds. And the consequences did not belong to one morning. They unfolded across centuries. Today, debates about Columbus often focus on statues, holidays, and public memory. Should he be honored? Should monuments remain? Should Columbus Day become Indigenous Peoples' Day? Different communities answer in different ways. For some Italian Americans, the holiday remembers ancestors who faced prejudice and violence in the United States. Columbus became a symbol of belonging in a nation that did not always accept them. For many indigenous communities, honoring Columbus feels like celebrating the beginning of invasion. Both memories exist, but they do not carry the same historical cost. Public history is never only about the past. It reveals what societies choose to value in the present. A statue is not merely a stone description of an old event. It is an act of honor. Removing one does not erase history. Keeping one does not automatically teach it. The real question is what story stands around the monument. Is Columbus presented as a flawless hero, as a monster without context, or as a complicated and consequential figure whose courage cannot be separated from the violence of colonization? History becomes useful when it resists comfort. The voyage of 1492 was an astonishing feat of navigation. It also began a catastrophe for the Caribbean's indigenous peoples. Both statements are true. Neither cancels the other. The ocean crossing required courage. The colonial systems created afterward caused suffering. Columbus could be visionary and mistaken, religious and ruthless, brilliant at sea and destructive on land. The past does not become clearer when we flatten it. It becomes clearer when we allow its contradictions to remain visible. Perhaps we should return one final time to the Atlantic. It is late in the voyage. The ships have been sailing west for weeks. The sailors wake beneath unfamiliar stars. The sea is dark blue. The wind presses steadily into the sails. Behind them lies Europe. Ahead lies a world they cannot imagine. Columbus walks the deck. He studies the compass. He measures speed. He watches birds. He tells the men that land is near. He has said it before. Some believe him. Some no longer do. The wooden hull creaks. Ropes pull against the masts. Water moves past the ship. No one knows how far the ocean continues. No one knows whether the wind will ever carry them home. Yet the fleet keeps moving. This is the image that made Columbus a legend. A man facing the unknown. But beyond the horizon, other people are also waking. Fishermen prepare their canoes. Families tend cassava fields. Smoke rises from village fires. Children run beneath trees. Leaders think about alliances and rival communities. The day begins as it has begun many times before. They do not know that sails are moving toward them. They do not know that the strangers will call their island by another name. They do not know that European kings will claim their homeland from across an ocean. They do not know that their descendants will struggle to make the world remember they were there. History often focuses on the people aboard the ships, but the shore is part of the story too. Without the shore, the voyage is only an unfinished crossing. Without the people waiting there is no encounter. And without remembering them, the story becomes a legend instead of history. Near 2 in the morning, Rodrigo de Triana looks into the darkness. He sees a shape. He calls out. The cannon fires. Men rise from sleep. They climb onto the deck. They stare toward the horizon. Land. The word moves through the ships. Land. Some men pray. Some laugh. Some imagine gold. Columbus waits for daylight. When morning comes, the island glows beneath the sun. The water is calm. The trees are green. People stand on the beach. For one brief moment, neither side knows what the meeting will become. There is still time for peace. There is still time for curiosity without conquest. There is still time for gifts to remain gifts. But the ships carry more than sailors. They carry the ambitions of kingdoms. They carry ideas of empire. They carry diseases hidden in living bodies. They carry contracts claiming authority over lands not yet seen. They carry a hunger that one island cannot satisfy. The boats move toward shore. Columbus raises the royal banner. Feet touch the sand, and the world begins to change. Not because one man discovered a silent continent, but because two human worlds, separated for thousands of years, were joined by a route that would never close again. The meeting created wealth beyond imagination. It created new foods, new societies, new cultures, and a truly global age. It also created conquest, slavery, epidemic disease, and loss on an almost unimaginable scale. History remembers the ships, the Niña, the Pinta, the Santa María. History remembers the date, 1492. History remembers the admiral, Christopher Columbus. But beneath the famous names are millions of lives. Sailors who crossed the ocean, islanders who watched them arrive, families who survived conquest, people carried in chains, communities rebuilt after epidemics, generations who inherited a world transformed by that first permanent crossing. Columbus sailed west searching for Asia. He found lands he could not understand. He opened a route he could not control, and he began a history whose consequences reached far beyond his dreams. The greatest mistake of his life became one of the most important voyages in human history. But the true story was never simply about finding land. It was about what happened after the ships arrived. It was about what people chose to take, what they chose to destroy, what they chose to create, and what the world would never be able to undo. As the centuries passed, the Atlantic no longer separated distant worlds. It connected them. Ships moved through the same waters Columbus had crossed. Some carried settlers hoping for new lives. Some carried soldiers. Some carried silver. Some carried sugar. Some carried enslaved people beneath locked decks. Some carried letters between families who would never meet again. The ocean became a place of hope and terror, of departure and arrival, of freedom for some and captivity for others. And beneath every voyage remained the memory of those 3 ships entering the darkness in 1492. Columbus believed the sea would lead him to the riches of the East. Instead, it led humanity into a new age. An age of global connection. An age of empire. An age of exchange. An age of conquest. An age whose shadows and possibilities still surround us. Perhaps that is why his story refuses to disappear. It is not simply the story of one navigator. It is the story of the moment the modern world began to take shape. A world connected across oceans. A world made richer by exchange. A world scarred by domination. A world in which courage and cruelty could travel aboard the same ship. And as the final light fades over the Atlantic, the question remains. Was Columbus's voyage the triumph of human curiosity, or the moment curiosity became conquest? If this quiet journey through the past carried you across the ocean, subscribe for more long and peaceful history stories to fall asleep to.